The book of Genesis tells us that the first descendant of Abraham to arrive in Egypt was his great-grandson, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to a caravan of traders who brought him down. Then, in an amazing turn of events, he rises to become the highest official in Egypt. He saves the country from terrible famine, enables his father Jacob and his entire family to settle in the best part of the land, a place called Goshen.
Who is Joseph?
Well, Joseph is a Western Asiatic character, a Semitic-speaking person who has entered Egypt, as the story tells us, and he becomes a slave. He's brought into Egypt and sold into slavery. And for some amazing reason, he becomes the highest official in the land. He's only second to Pharaoh, as far as power is concerned. And he managed to achieve this by foretelling or explaining the dreams of Pharaoh, dreams that Pharaoh's having, sort of nightmares about cattle coming out of the waters of the Nile. As first of all, 7 fat cows, and then 7 lean cows come out and devour the fat cows. It's an extraordinary story. But the clue here is that these cows are coming out of the Nile. It's the Nile itself which is the cause of both the plenty and the famine.
I'm curious, you used the word Semite.
Yeah.
Is it Semitic? A Semite?
Yeah.
Explain that.
A Semite is somebody who speaks a Semitic language. In the modern world, that means the Israelis and the Arabs, for instance. In the ancient world, it meant the Israelites, because the Israelites spoke a Semitic language, so we call them Semites.
Mm-hmm. But are there other groups that are Semites as well in the ancient world?
Of course, the Assyrians were, the Babylonians were. The Egyptians weren't. They didn't speak a Semitic language. But those people who spoke Semitic languages are called Semites.
Mm-hmm. And Joseph was a Semite.
Joseph was a Semite.
But at the time, he was not an Israelite. He was a Semite.
Well, the question of when the Israelites appear in history is quite well explained in the Bible. The Israelites are the sons of Jacob. Mm-hmm. So Joseph is an Israelite. Okay, but the Israelites only begin then.
Because he was a son of Israel.
Yes, Israel is Jacob.
Mm-hmm. So once Jacob's name turned to Israel, they became sons of Israel.
Exactly, and those 12 sons are the founding fathers of the Israelite nation.
And the 12 tribes.
And the 12 tribes.
If you were to describe Joseph, what type of a character is he?
Well, as a young boy, I think he's quite brash. I think he's got a bit of an ego, if you like. He's the favourite of his father. He's given this multicoloured coat, which none of the other sons have got. So jealous of him. So I think he's quite an arrogant young man. But when he's, of course, sent into slavery into Egypt, his character changes.
What happened to him?
He's thrown in prison.
Why? How did he get to Egypt?
Well, the other brothers throw him down a well. To keep him where he is, and then they take this multicolored coat and they cover it with goat's blood, and they take it to the father, Jacob, and say the boy is being killed by a lion. So the father then mourns, and they give him to Midianite traders who sell him into slavery in Egypt. They take him all the way to Egypt and sell him into slavery.
Egypt plays a very important role in the trade from the ancient Near East. Egypt was the Nile was a conduit of African luxury goods coming north, such as ivory and ebony, high-quality woods, myrrh, incense. These things came from Africa and Arabia. And so the idea of traders moving back and forth between ancient Canaan and Egypt has been going on since the end of the 4th millennium BC. So the idea that Joseph would have been brought to Egypt by slave traders, they were probably not slave traders, they were bringing other things with them. In fact, the Bible even tells us they had balm and other products of the land of Canaan. So the slave trade part of it was just one facet of a much larger trade network that was going on at that time.
If we go back to Beni Hassan and talk about that tomb painting.
Sure.
Let's talk a bit about that.
The famous painting in the tomb of Khnum-Hotep at Beni Hassan shows a group of 37, we're told, A'amu. These are Semitic-speaking foreigners who've come to Egypt. They're probably engaged in trade. They were specifically in Egypt to do mining and metalworking and so on. There are pictures of their bellows for their stoking up the fires, for their smelting work, and so on. So we do know that foreigners were coming into Egypt at different periods of time, and so the idea of a family like Jacob, an extended family, moving into Egypt for hardship or economic reasons is not unparalleled. These sort of things did happen.
Have you seen any other collaboration in history about famine in Egypt outside of Egypt? What I'm suggesting that people from outside of Egypt traveled to Egypt.
We have examples on the tomb paintings from the Middle Kingdom of people arriving in Egypt, but they're not associated with famine necessarily, they're associated more with trade. So for instance at Beni Hassan you get these Asiatics or Western Asiatic peoples, Semitic speaking peoples, arriving in Egypt with their multicolored coats on, and they're trading eye makeup. And it's exactly at the same time that we have the arrival of the Asiatics at Avaris. People arriving, maybe 30 or 40 people at a time, with this appearing in Egypt, coming across Sinai, arriving in Egypt, and they are foreigners. They're from the north.
So there's a tendency to show that obviously trade was happening, but the question I had was, is there any specific for grain? Do you see grain trade happening in any other outside source?
I have no example of that I can think of. However, remember the story of Jacob coming into Egypt. He's invited by Joseph, the vizier, who's been given permission by Pharaoh to bring him into the land. So it's not a matter of trade we're dealing with here, or grain transport. It's a matter of people in the north starving because of famine and being invited into the rich land of Egypt to survive.
Is the story of Joseph even feasible in Egyptian culture?
The biblical story of Joseph is one of the most intriguing ones in the Bible. There is no direct archaeological evidence that would help us say, yes, this is Joseph in history and space and time as we know it. But what the Egyptological evidence can do is flesh out the picture, provide the context, provide background information that enables us to look at the story of Joseph and say, yes, this rings true. Let me give you a few examples. Number one, there is the fact that Joseph is sold into Egypt as a slave for 20 shekels of silver. Studies have been done and shown that this was the price of slaves in the early part of the second millennium BC. As time went on, by the time you get to the second half of the second millennium BC, the price of slaves is going up to 30 shekels, and on as we go in time, inflation sets in, the price of slaves gets higher. So the very fact that the asking price for Joseph, 20 shekels of silver, fits that unique window of time between 1500 BC and 1800 BC. Another case might be that Joseph comes to Egypt to work in the household of a high-ranking and important official. We know this sort of thing was going on in Egypt. We have a papyrus, it's now in the Brooklyn Museum, that contains the names of foreign servants, many of them having Semitic names, like Joseph's name. This comes from the 18th century BC, roughly the time of Joseph, and these servants worked in the house of an Egyptian master. And even the title of some of these in Egyptian, hairy pair, those who are over the house, is precisely what Joseph is when he works for Potiphar. He is over the house of Potiphar. So we do know that there were foreign slaves, servants working in the homes of upper-class Egyptians in the early second millennium BC.
On an island just below the first cataract of the Nile, an ancient inscription written around the 4th century BC was found which claimed to be a copy of a document written by Pharaoh Djoser more than 1,000 years earlier. It is the story of a land grant made by the Pharaoh to the priests of the god Num. It tells of 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty, how Pharaoh had a dream and consulted his chancellor for help. It contains most elements of the 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty story, although they were corrupted in this account, written over 1,000 years after the event took place. But most importantly, the priests who wrote this inscription were relying upon the land grants made by this pharaoh to justify their claim to some land. They were not writing what they believed was an ancient myth. They obviously believed the land grants made by Pharaoh Djoser to still be valid and of enough authority to still be in effect well over 1,000 years later. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Only the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh. Ancient Egyptian records list Djoser as the 16th pharaoh of Egypt, and historians have classified him with the so-called Third Dynasty. His chancellor, named Imhotep, was first known through the writings of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who in the 3rd century BC wrote, "During Djoser's reign there lived a man named Imhotep who had the reputation of the Greek god of medicine and who invented the art of building with hewn stone." The legends attributed to Imhotep were so incredible that he was considered to be mythical until this century, when excavations at Djoser's pyramid complex revealed the base of a statue with the name Djoser on it and the name Imhotep with his long list of titles, one of which was chief under the king, a title which first appears with Imhotep and also was first bestowed upon Joseph. Imhotep was also the architect of Pharaoh Djoser's pyramid and surrounding complex, a veritable city within a city of incredible beauty and extremely advanced in design. Built on the plateau of Saqqara, adjacent to ancient Memphis, the pyramid within the complex is the first ever built in Egypt. Ron Wyatt spent a great deal of time here searching for evidence which might shed light on the biblical account. Such an event as the famine described in the story of Joseph and the distribution of grain to the other countries would have required a major facility and system of organization. When the famine came and Joseph's brothers came from Canaan to get grain from Egypt, we are told that they went to Joseph, which indicates that he personally oversaw the distribution, at least to those coming from foreign countries. And this would mean that there was certainly a central location or granary to which the foreigners came. The complex at Saqqara contains 11 massive pits, which even the Egyptians are at a loss to explain. They are not tombs, for all tombs were underground and carefully sealed, while these were accessible from the surface. And they are extremely large. But most fascinating is the fact that they are all connected by chutes. Ron believes these were the grain storage pits of the 7-year famine. As grain was removed from one pit, grain from the other pits flowed through the chutes, making the grain always accessible from one location. These are within the wall of the step pyramid complex, which has only one entrance, and it opens to a long covered passageway with small cubicles on each side, each just the right size for a person to sit with perhaps a small table. The narrow, singular entrance would have allowed only a few people to enter at a time. There was no doubt in Ron's mind that this was the main center of grain distribution on a massive scale.
As people arrived to get their grain, they lined up to enter the long corridor. Inside, they paid one of the cashiers in one of the cubicles for the grain. After payment was made, perhaps they were given a sack for grain which reflected the amount of their payment. Then they proceeded through the corridor straight to the area of the grain bins. Once there, they descended the stairway next to the storage bins, handed their sack to a worker who filled it with grain and returned it to them. Then they exited through a small door on the lower level, which led to the outside of the complex.
When the pits were first excavated, bits of grain still remained in them. During the 7-year famine, Egypt gained great wealth and prominence among the nations through the selling of the grain. The Egyptians who lived in their cities along the Nile had little to do during the famine, since they had a 7-year supply of grain to rely on and were able to devote their time to the building projects of the Pharaoh, not as slaves, but as grateful subjects. The family of Jacob, who lived in the delta, separate from the native population, prospered and grew, exempt from the 1/5 taxation levied on the native population. From the time Jacob's family came to Egypt until the birth of Moses, many pharaohs had come and gone, many ruling contemporaneously with others in different regions. But until now, all recognized the rights granted to the people of Israel to live in the land of Ramses. But that was about to change.
David Rohl, author, historian, and Egyptologist, is an agnostic, someone who remains unconvinced of the existence of God. Yet, he clearly sees archaeological evidence of the biblical Joseph, Jacob, and the early Hebrews in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. Rohl believes that many Egyptologists have missed evidence for the Exodus because they have been looking for it in the wrong time period. While most scholars think that the events of the Exodus happened in the New Kingdom, David Rohl's view would put the Exodus in an entirely different period, the earlier Middle Kingdom, where he claims evidence for the Exodus can be seen.
I wanted him to explain why he had come to such a different conclusion than Manfred Bietek about Joseph and the early Israelites. Tell me, who is Manfred Bietek?
Manfred Bietek is probably one of the greatest archaeologists alive today, and he's dug at one of the most important sites in the Eastern Delta, a city called Avaris, which is in the land of Goshen, which the Bible calls it, and I believe this is the place where Joseph and his brethren lived.
Well, I went to see Manfred Bietek.
Right.
And that's not what he said. He said there's no evidence of this at the time of Ramesses.
Exactly right. Most scholars will say if you look at the city of Ramesses, there are no Asiatics there. There are no Western Asiatics living at that particular city. But dig down a little bit deeper, and you do find a city full of Asiatics.
Yeah, but the Bible says it happened at the time of Ramesses. Mm-hmm. What are you saying?
I'm saying that this particular mention of the city of Ramses, the building of Ramses, is what we call an anachronism. It's something that's been added into the text later by an editor. Mm-hmm. So what the editor is basically saying is, this is the place where the Israelites built the store city, and we know it today as Ramesses. Well, in the ancient times, it was called Avaris.
Okay, so the people would know the area, the region.
The people of the Bible would have known where Ramesses was and where, therefore, their ancestors actually built the city.
I also found that the Bible, in the book of Genesis, uses the word Ramesses hundreds of years before Pharaoh Ramesses or his city existed to describe the land where Joseph's family settled. So if the name Ramesses in Genesis does not refer to the time of Pharaoh Ramesses II, then why should the mention of Ramesses in the book of Exodus be any different?
Now this Avaris is the city which lies under the biblical Ramesses. Ramesses of the New Kingdom, Avaris of the Middle Kingdom, the 13th dynasty. It lies underneath the city that's mentioned in the Bible. So when Bietek digs up a huge population of Semitic-speaking peoples, Semitic culture, living in the city of Avaris for several hundred years, and then, at the end of the period, these Semites all leave, depart with their belongings and abandon the city, whatever Manfred says, that to me sounds awfully like the Israelites.
Well, what he told me was that there was no connection.
Well, look at the evidence that you've got here.
Right at the beginning, at the heart of this community, at the end of the 12th dynasty,
we see a Syrian house appear. The Austrians call them Mittelsaal houses. This type of house is found in North Syria, the area where Abraham came from. It's exactly the same style of house you'd expect Jacob to build for himself in Egypt. And we know that the Israelites sought their brides from Haran in that region. They all went back to get their brides from there. So the culture that turns up in Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty seems to have come from North Syria originally.
So what is the connection with Joseph out of Aras?
Well, after this House of Jacob, if we can call it that, is built, eventually it's flattened, and on top of it, an Egyptian palace is constructed, Egyptian architecture this time. However, the occupant was not Egyptian.
The palace had courtyards, colonnades, audience chambers. There was even a robing room.
It obviously belonged to some high official of state who was very, very important to that state. Because when somebody gets a palace like this given to them, it means they're being honoured for what they've done for the state.
Now, in the garden behind the palace, the archaeologists found 12 main graves with memorial chapels on top of them.
You have 12
We
graves.
have 12 graves.
And why would that be significant?
Well, think about it. How many sons did Jacob have?
He had 12.
How many tribes were there?
12 tribes.
Exactly. And what's also amazing is the palace had a facade, a portico with 12 pillars. So you've got 12 sons, 12 tribes, 12 pillars, and 12 tombs.
Interesting.
Yeah. Is that all coincidence?
Now, one of these 12 graves was very special because it was a pyramid tomb. This in itself is extraordinary because only pharaohs and queens had pyramid tombs at this time. Yet the person buried in this tomb was not a king. Even so, he was honored with a king's burial. And inside the chapel of the tomb was a statue. What we know from the statue is that this man had red hair. He had pale yellow skin, which is how Egyptians depict northerners. He had a throw stick across his shoulder, a unique symbol of office made for this Asiatic official living in the land of Goshen. And on the back of his shoulder, we see the faintest remains of paint, coloured stripes from a multicolored coat.
And that matches exactly with the story of Joseph in the Bible. Multicolored coat is a gift which shows that he was the favorite of the father. Almost becomes his insignia, this coat. It's the thing we remember about him most of all.
Do you know of any other statues of a Semite of this kind in Egypt?
There is nothing else like this in the whole of Egyptian history.
Really?
Nothing at all.
David Rowe is not the only one to see a connection with Joseph at Avaris. Mahoney went to see Professor Charles Ayling, an Egyptologist who has also investigated the events of the Exodus and its connection to Egypt.
Would it be unusual for a tomb to have a statue?
No. It's unusual to have one this large. This would be probably twice the size of a normal human being.
What does that tell you when the statue's larger?
That it's a very important person. Now, of course, this is not a pharaoh's tomb or palace, but the man who lived there, you can identify his nationality by looking at the fragments of the statue. Three things. The hairstyle he has, which we often call the mushroom hairstyle, and then secondly, the weapon he carries over his shoulder called a throw stick, which we would associate with like an Australian boomerang, and then the coloration of the skin. The skin is yellow. All those things indicate that this would have been a Syro-Palestinian.
Dr. Ayling, do you think this is Joseph?
Either it is Joseph or it's somebody that has a career remarkably the same as Joseph did. It's just an incredible thing to find this at this time period.